Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Gear Talk. Today, we're stepping back from the COG, stepping back from Grozny, Outsiders, all that. We're going back to the OG survivors of the series. We're talking about the Stranded today. And today we're going to be talking about all of the different outposts and camps and territories that were held by the Stranded during their time when the Stranded were an actual faction. Later on, we do learn that there's barely any remnants of them in the future known as Pickers, but mostly we have them turning into Outsiders or Nomads or anything in between. But back when the Stranded were stranded, there were a lot of places they called home, and quite a lot of Stranded called these places home too. There were a lot more than I believe for Stranded. So, we're going to just go through the list of everywhere the Stranded called home, look at their leaders, where they planted their flag in those territories, and exactly what we were looking at for these places, or if they're even still around towards the end of the war, leading into the 25 years of peace. So, let's get into it and see what we've got for all of these different Stranded camps. Before we get into that too, by the way, this is like my normal jacket that I wear during like the winter. When I'm recording this right now, I had to get it back out because it's the almost summer right now. So this is what I wear in the winter. This is my normal jacket. But I figured like with how Dizzy looked when he was stranded and the Stranded in general, this was like really like perfect for the fit of just like survival, wear something warm and easy. So I was like, you know what? The jacket feels like it's Stranded brand. I like it. So we're going with this jacket to go with the Stranded. So starting off, let's talk about Ephyra, the Stranded that were found in Ephyra and who their leader was. So the leader of the Ephirian Stranded was actually Franklin Tisoko. We learn about this very early on, about the Stranded in general. When we play the first game, we meet Franklin and his group. Now they're pretty neutral with the COG. Most Stranded are not a fan, but his group are like neutral. Like, they don't really have, like, a high standing of them, but they don't see them as, like, the worst thing in the world. Because also you have Dom with you when you go and meet them, and Dom is kind of on good terms with Franklin, so they're kind of, like, okay with one another. The main home base they call in Ephyra is the New Ephirian Outpost. That is what they call it, and that pretty much, like, spans out quite a ways. There's a main fortress that they build up, like a good, heavily guarded main hub for everything, but you see as you go through the first game that it spreads pretty far out. Like, Chaps' gas station you have, the checkpoints. It's actually pretty far out for the territory that Franklin holds in Ephyra. Now, I don't think he's the only one in Ephyra, but he is the only one that we see in Ephyra. So, at least for what we see when it comes to the Ephirian outpost, that is definitely under Franklin's command, and he is the one in charge. Now, later on, we don't really learn what happens with Franklin, because of the fact that with his group, at the end of it all, basically gets destroyed and there's just ruins of the outpost left. And Franklin and the rest of his group kind of go off to, like, Jacinto, and they go there for, like, just being defended. And they see it as, like, okay, this is COG territory, but it's majorly defended and we're at least safe here. And we see him there with Chaps and the other people that survive with his group. And then we don't know what really happens with Franklin because of the fact that in 2, with the deleted story we have with Road to Ruin, we don't know if he's alive or dead. So that's all we know. We do know that his outpost at least survives, because we at least see in 5, when we go through the areas towards the end of the game, the outpost, the ruins of it at least, are still kind of there. So, I mean, we don't know what happens with Franklin or the rest of the group, but we do know at least, the outpost survived. And that's what we're here to talk about, or the actual group's outposts and camps of the Stranded. Next up, we jump over to Aldair. And Aldair is where we find Michaela Dorn leading her own group of Stranded. So we find her, like, right after the hammers drop. They're like the first formation of Stranded. And she's defending against the Locust and fighting off. And she actually calls her home base of operations in Aldair the Mammoth, as we see later on, which another group we're going to be getting to. The Mammoth plays a big role in, like, survival. It's like a moving giant fortress, and they decide to call that home. Now, what we see in Aldair, at least, is that it doesn't seem like it's moving that much as it does later on. We're going to get to them next, but it does seem like that's at least the home base for them, where they can at least go inside of and defend. So they called that the main area in Aldair that they would move around in and they would seek cover in. And we see later on with that group in Aldair from Michaela's group, they actually merge and form into another group we come up to, the next one being Alpha's group, or like the Alpha Squad, or Gabe's Convoy as I always call it. So Gabe's Convoy is actually another Stranded group that is actually officially formed after hunting down Ukon. So Michaela joined in with her group, and they were basically assisting the COG after everything went foobar, and that was basically shut down by Prescott when he believed he killed them. They kind of went off radar and became Stranded of their own, but they were a very special kind of Stranded. Their Stranded group is actually like the first iteration or first groupings of or creation of the Outsider movement. So they were actually the ones that were going to be the forerunners for that, which Gabe was leading, and he was actually still taking his group after they officially became Stranded, and they were taking the Mammoth around throughout all the areas, whether they were over in like Tyrus or they were over in Vasgar, and they were traveling around fighting off the remnants of Ukon's side of the Locust military. But then later on, they returned back to Tyrus, and they actually did found their outpost area. And I'm assuming with Gabe and with everyone else that was a part of it, like you have Michaela, Reyna, and you have Sid, they all must have just said like, okay, you know what, we're actually playing the flag, no more moving. And it's unknown what happened to the Mammoth, but by the looks of it, they did just actually go into one area and say we're good. So that's what happened to Gabe's group, and by chance also Michaela, since they all formed into one single stranded camp or outpost, or for them, just a moving convoy. The next area we have is Char. So Char was actually the home base for Aaron Griffin, because he was already a big old emulsion tycoon, and he ran a large company with emulsion involved. So he was actually already like well stocked as being a wealthy man in a giant tower, and just like being already defended and ready. So when everything happened, he never evacuated or left. He stayed in his tower, i.e. creating the stranded situation he found himself in, where it was him and his employees. And with Char being like the epicenter of one of the hits from the Hammers, Char was basically empty except for his group and his tower. His tower was not hit. So he basically took it upon himself to take over all of Char. Like some areas we'll come to later on, there's multiple like camps or outposts in these cities. By what we can tell, Griffin had like the entire city under his thumb. It was all his. And they were utilizing like basically a method of going across to like major areas or towers through like a pulley system. So like there'd be a cart and they'd pull it across. So they didn't do anything on the ground because that was still like lambent, and now and then you would have the locust moving through. So they stayed up in between the towers moving, and it worked really well. He had a very powerful group under his thumb. The only problem was is that once the formers became a thing and his refineries were being attacked and everything was kind of like, you know, emulsion was changing people, that's where he started losing his numbers. And then later on, the final like group that he had when Delta was around was attacked by Mira. The entirety of like his family, as he would call it, were essentially wiped out except for him and Dizzy. And Dizzy was held hostage, so I don't even count that. So as far as we were aware at the time, Griffin was the last one. Later on, we do learn that Griffin, and I'm just going to say Griffin, not even his group, because they were basically wiped out. He formed like another group kind of, or at least he was brought on. And he was brought in by Anya in the books to help bring humanity back up to a working like society. So he was brought back into the fold of things. And I guess at that point, technically, he was no longer stranded. So essentially, with his group, with his tower and everything, they were brought in. And I guess technically they were brought in to be, I guess, COG. So he ends up becoming a COG citizen at the end of it all. So that's what happens with the settlements in Char. Halvo Bay is up next now. Halvo Bay is very fun because of the fact that it was originally like one of the first cities that were majorly attacked. Like not even like after the E-Day attacks, another one that was majorly hit was Halvo when they were fighting off everyone that was attacking the city with the locusts. And it was really interesting because of the fact that all of this fighting, the one person who basically called Halvo Bay his home and became the leader of Halvo Bay for his stranded group was Garen Paddock. So came over from Grozny, fought there, abandoned the COG, and became the leader of his stranded group. Now, it's important to say, too, that Paddock doesn't see him as being a stranded or his group as stranded, but as we get to some other groups that don't see it that way, they are stranded. Like, the definition of what you are, you know, is the stranded group itself. Like, what you represent and are doing is what the stranded are. Yes, you may not have been, like, stranded during the Hammers or anything, but you're essentially stranded. They called their main operation for theirs, like, the main base they had was actually, and it was interesting because they had to move it. They had the emulsion rig that, like, was brought into shore. They actually called that home because it made its way into the center of Halvo, so they used that as like a very high up area where they had the drop on everything, they could scout the areas. But then once that was taken over by formers because of the emulsion, they actually had to move everything over to Seahorse Hills, which is like towards like the higher end of Halvo Bay, like where the rich lived, where they looked down upon the town. So he went to the ground with his group, but he was still on a higher area to look down. And as far as we can tell, they all made it out alive because Paddock comes up in 5, and these people that made Halvo Bay their home and followed Paddock, they were the first iteration of the Nomads. So the Nomads were the ones who were in Tyrus and Kashkur and Vasgar, and they were the ones that would travel around and just, they'd never have a home base. Much like Outsiders, except they never called one area home, and they didn't really form any kind of government. They were just nomadic. They just traveled around. That's just what they did. Paddock's group made it to the end, and that is basically how we see it. And then his his main group ended up going over to Vaskar, and that's where they call home currently. The Dorado Hills. Now, this territory is pretty long and expansive, so it's not like one group is going to own this entire area, but we do get one camp that's at least mentioned, or village, that at least calls this area home and at least has a wider spread of at least knowing what's going on. And this is actually, and I can't really say the name of the town at all because of the fact that it's YouTube. This is actually the town of Freakity Dookity Docky Dock 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 Bukak, Fucked. So that is the town that is like here. It was built right after the hammers hit, and it's a very depressing village. Most people here are not the happiest. It is always a state of like sadness. They're always attacked by like waves of locusts that'll go through the area, or they just barely can make it by, and this is the situation we find. Again, the base of operations is the village itself, and by what we can tell, they have a pretty vast scouting area. We don't know who the leader here is, but we do get introduced to like one of the main characters from here, which is John Boy. And John Boy is one of the scouts that goes out and finds Delta and brings them back to the village, where Delta is able to save them and fight off the locusts that have been going through and attacking them. So as far as we can tell, we don't know what happens later in the future to Fucked, but we do see that at least they're at least alive, and at least in their definition, I guess, well, they're not really the best place to be, but they're surviving. That's the best to say. So that's Dorado Hills. From the hills to a mountain, we now go to Mount Kadar. So there were actual stranded who called Mount Kadar home, and these stranded were actually led by a stranded by the name of Stu. But unfortunately, later on when Stu was captured, another important character we know of, the best character in the entire series, Stick Dastardly's favorite character that ever existed in the entire franchise, Chaps, takes over, and he is now the de facto leader of the Mount Kadar group. So what the Mount Kadar group was doing, and it was weird because they never had like a home base, they just wandered like the outer hollows, and their mindset, what they thought was correct, I don't understand because they went directly into the enemy's home turf, was since all the fighting is happening on the surface, what if we all went to the outer hollows, because they wouldn't expect us to find, we wouldn't be there. They wouldn't expect us to be hiding there. And, we could just hide out there since they're all going to go to the surface. Well, the locusts call the hollows home in general. So sooner or later they were going to find them. And that's what happened. And Stu's group, once Chaps' faction of everything made it in, ended up getting captured. And this is the same group that Maria called her group. When she was bouncing around everything, she ended up, the final one she was in was Stu's group that became Chaps. And once that was done, Chaps was trying to relocate everyone again to go towards like the inner Lake River area they were traveling when Delta found them. And Delta actually decided to get a hold of them and get them out of there because, again, it's like, you're in the hollows. You are at Mount Kadar. Like, this is not safe at all. We will get you out of here. So they split the team up, and it's actually Baird and Cole who get them out, while we have Dom and Marcus go further in to find Maria and also find some other things. But at that point, Dom's only thinking Maria. The mission, we don't need to worry about that. We got to find Maria and Stu, but Stu doesn't matter. The next area we get is Oblivion Central. So Oblivion Central is very lightly mentioned when we have the books. This is basically like the first place where Dizzy called like home when he was a stranded. So when everything happened and he became stranded, this was like the first place where he actually like was at. So Dizzy, when he goes through his journey of being a stranded, ends up at quite a few places. He travels quite a bit. But this was like the first place as an official stranded. Dizzy was not a combatant or anything. He was basically just a past like merchant marine. That's all he was. So we end up here, and their leader is by the name of Nikolos. Nikolos is their leader, and it's a very small camp, but now and then they are attacked by the locusts. They are able to defend themselves, and they actually do win some battles against the locusts. We don't know what happens to them further on in the future, but we do know that, at least for Oblivion Central, there were some that were there. They only state that they were in a squatter's camp, so I can't imagine this was a very large settlement. And that's all we really get from it. We have no idea what happens afterwards because Dizzy continues his adventure, and we just kind of leave it in the past. Speaking of Dizzy's journey, we'll go to the last place he was stranded. So this is actually Alima, and we've talked much about Alima in the past. Alima was one of the major cities where the Cog were fighting off the locusts towards like the mid-era of the war. So this was a pretty hotly battled area between Locust and Cog constantly. This is where Shadow of Rom takes place, and in 2, Alima gets sunk by the Riftworm. So we have no idea who the leader is here. We don't know like what the main base was. It was basically just the town itself because people just call it home here and there. There was no main area, but we do see that the Stranded did call this home, and when everything dropped, unfortunately that group was annihilated, or very few made it out alive, because that entire city got sunk. So Alima, it was just surprising. We have a lot of information about Alima, but the stranded there we just don't have that much on. So unfortunately, Alima got sunk. Yeah, there was nothing left of their group. Mercy was actually a very interesting area for the stranded, because after everything happened with E-Day and the Locust War beginning, Mercy was relatively emptied out, like everyone evacuated, and then the people who took over were the stranded. And by how we can tell, this was like a major hub for trade when it came to the stranded groups. It seems like the city itself was kind of not really friendly, but like open. And the base of operations for the city itself, it seems like the stranded ran this like a normal city. So I would assume by the look of it, by the layout of the town, I would assume Town Hall would have been like the main like base for everything, just because of the fact that they were running things throughout the town. You know, they had the emulsion pumps going. This was trade of emulsion between the stranded. So it was weird, because Mercy was an actual functioning society. Like, this might have been, if Mercy didn't get attacked by the Formers and destroyed, this could have been how the Outsider movement began, because they ran it just like an Outsider village would be. So I guess the idea is that, hey, the Cog may have abandoned us, but we can at least run a functioning society with trade and everything. And it doesn't seem like they had much for enemies, so I guess, yeah, Mercy was interesting. They could have worked, but unfortunately, emulsion, when you play with that stuff, you get zombie formers, so I mean, that's how it went. Currently, there was nothing left there. Mercy was basically, a portion of it was destroyed. I would assume it's still abandoned unless Outsiders decided to take over. So, yeah, for the group that was there, we didn't even get to see majority. We only saw a few of the characters by the time it was wiped out. Next up, we have Jelaine, and Jelaine is really interesting, because this is not run by like your normal stranded. This is run by the Grievous Bodily Love, with their leader, Matron. So their main flag base of operation for everything here was the actual birthing farm where they all were. So the birthing farms is an extremely controversial thing. Not even controversial, it's just downright bad. There's no arguing it. Where essentially women were brought in that were fertile and had good genes, and they brought in the genes of very good soldiers to produce more soldiers in case the war kept going on for a while. That's what it was. So when the Locust attacked and slaughtered everyone there, the remaining women, along with like the children that were being born, were still alive, and they fought off, and they made that their actual area, was Jelaine itself and the birthing farm specifically. So these are like Amazonian looking women, and they are ready to fight to the death. Now, with their group, some of them did die during the final battles when Delta got there to see what was going on. It was Delta, Sigma, and Foxtrot. And they did get a good amount of them out of there, but by what it sounds like and how they word it, it's weird. It makes it sound like they returned there. Like, after they got taken out, they're like, okay, we're going to reassemble, and we're going to go and fight and take it back. And it's like, okay, you aren't at full numbers anymore, and there are children involved, but I mean, you know, the Grievous know what they're doing. You know, they are battle-hardened women that'll kick anyone's ass. So right now, we don't know what happens to them in the future, which sucks because there are some interesting characters you meet. So I'm assuming they made it to the end of the war. I got fingers crossed. I'm hoping. I don't know how they're going to do against Lambency, but I'm hoping. At this current moment, if you're keeping up with the comic series we're covering, you should know also that we are dealing with Montevado, which is an area where we had multiple stranded camps, but by the time we are aware of everything when the story happens, there's only 2 that remain, and one of them is wiped out essentially right away. So we're only going to focus on the one that's there. Montevado is not the entire city that's run by one group. In fact, it's multiple. We have some more coming up like that. And this is actually, we don't get a name for it at all. It's basically just a stranded camp at Montevado. It's just a small group of people that are there surviving. They even state like most of us are just surviving, trying to make sure the wretches don't kill us. And there is no leader, but it seems that someone that is giving orders at the time is a gentleman with dreadlocks, so I would assume he might be in charge because everyone else that's there is listening to him or they're injured. So I think he would be in charge, but it's never stated, so I put unknown for now. This is the last one that's there when Delta finally finds it, and they are actually evacuated. So we do have it where this group does actually make it over to Jacinto. We don't know what happens, but because we see the condition of Lily's mother, which is one of the people a part of that group, I would assume that they are alive and well at Jacinto at the time. We're jumping to other countries now with Kashkir. So Kashkir is where we find Anvil Gate. That is not really stranded. Well, technically everyone is stranded after the coalition's end, but we aren't going to talk about that. They've got their own functioning societies. we're looking at the OG Stranded here. So over in Kashkir, there is an actual group that we find. We aren't giving any name for like their main base of operations. We just know they have a camp somewhere nearby, and we do see that there really isn't a leader. It's just a group of people. And these people are the ones that are trading with Anvil Gate a lot. They trade for like fur and pelts, and they'll trade like emulsion or food. So they do have access to those kinds of things, while the hunting parties from Anvil Gate are trading them furs, because this is around the winter time we meet them, so they're looking kind of to keep warm. So I would assume it's just a smaller camp, since we don't get a lot more information on them. So yeah, figured I would mention them just because I wanted to list off like anyone that we know for groups, like anything that's definitive and we see the group itself. So I figured I'd throw Kashkir and give Kashkir some love. They don't get it too often. It's always nice to give the little guys some love. Vectis actually had their own Stranded group that they were dealing with in the books. So for people who read the books, you know about the Stranded Insurgency, which is something that is not talked about a lot outside of the books because it doesn't really come up in the games or anything. The Stranded Insurgency, just a bare bones of it all, was when the COG decided to move New Jacinto over to Vectis, they had to deal with the issue of the Stranded. So at the time after the flooding, the Locusts were kind of recuperating and getting their numbers back together, but the Stranded were now an issue that the COG needed to deal with because there were heavy Stranded over where they were going and the surrounding areas. So they kind of had to muscle their way in and clear out the Stranded problem. And the leader of the Vectis group, which is on the other side of the island of Palaruan, was the capital of the island where like the village was and where they were setting up New Jacinto. On the other side of the island, however, was their Stranded group led by Massey. Massey is a dick. So he would openly challenge the COG. Like he would never, like they did attack the COG now and then, but guerrilla warfare style. He never had an outright fight with them because he knew the COG would kick his ass. And they did. So he kept on poking the bear, and the bear got mad and showed its teeth. But before that, the COG did offer Massey's group, hey, listen, because the COG understood they were low on manpower in general. If you decide to drop everything, stop being stranded, and join us, full amnesty of being stranded, you join us, you are now civilians of the COG, we will protect you. If you choose not to, however, you will be seen as an enemy. And there were roughly like half of the group decided to join the COG, like women and children did for protection. And a lot of the men stayed behind and chose to fight the COG, and that did not end well. A lot of them were killed by the COG, or the group was disbanded by the COG. So Massey's group did not last that long, and they were actually butting heads with another group, the biggest one we have ever seen, the Lesser Islands group, which is by far the largest group of Stranded we have ever seen in the entire series. And we are never given an exact number of how many there are. Their leader is Lyle Olivar. He is the leader, and he takes over for Daryl Jacuz. I have to look these names up because, again, these are just book names for these ones. So he's running this show, and he makes it abundantly clear there are numbers. How many? You don't need to know. We've got numbers. And Michelson, who's like in charge of knowing all the naval situations for the COG, he's even like, no, he's not kidding. These guys are like no joke. Could we beat them in a fight if we had all our numbers versus theirs? We probably could, but we are going to take losses. These guys are made to fight. So as far as we can understand, there is fleets and fleets and fleets, an armada of ships under Olivar's name. And they are ready to fight, and they are well prepared to fight. Because we do see a portion of those ships come in later on, and they actually choose to fight with the COG. They are like neutral with the COG. They understand that either of them could fight, and it could be a lose-lose for each side. So they see the COG as like, you know what? These are just other characters on the board at this point. But they do fight with the COG when things hit the fan with the Lambent. There's a situation where Leviathans, Polyps, everything are coming onto the shore of Vectis. And the Stranded, most of them are not idiots. Like, the majority of characters, especially the people in charge of the Lesser Islands faction, they are not dumb. They are very smart. He sees it, Olivar, as, okay, if you guys lose, there's a good chance that the Lambent will be coming for us next. We live on the ocean, okay? You need to win. So they actually decide to go to the island and fight with them, and they hold up really well. You have it where the Grozny, the COG, the Stranded are all fighting on the same team, and they hold off all of these creatures coming on. Once everything is done, he essentially, lack of better manners, flips them both the bird and says, okay, we're done. See you later. Good luck. And they leave. And we don't really see them again. They leave and they go off into the sunset. And as far as we're aware, they're still just floating around somewhere, or at least by the end of the war they are. They don't come and assist in the final battle or nothing. They stay to themselves. So We don't know if they become like outsiders or what their plans are. They're essentially pirates, so maybe there are Serrano pirates out there that are the descendants of these Stranded. We don't know. But this was the most dangerous group of Stranded ever seen throughout the entire franchise. Finally, we have a two-parter because of the fact that we go to Hanover. And Hanover did have multiple camps founded within the city, and they were their own separate entities. They were not connected or anything. Like we had with Franklin's group throughout all of Afira, we saw that with him at least. Like, he had some stretch, but he was still in charge. Here, there are different leaders. So the first one we get is actually the Hanover warehouse area, and this is actually led, and we never get a name, but the designs they use for the Hanover leaders are really cool. We have basically the warehouse Stranded leader is what she's called. She is a very friendly individual, and she is a big fan of the coal train. So, very nice people. They're willing to work and trade with the cog, so it seems like they don't have that much animosity, and they're just trying to survive. They stick to the warehouse area, and they do give a heads up like, hey, the next area you're going to go is going to be the warehouse that is run by Faraday. Faraday plants her flag over at the stadium, the Cougar Stadium, and that's her terrain. And Faraday also has a really cool design. Like, she's got a scar, she has an accent. I like it because they actually gave these leaders, even though they were like one-time use characters, actual design and character in their speech. I really love that. I think 3 did an amazing job at showing different like side characters and giving them a personality. So it was really nice. But Faraday is very rude. She is not hostile towards Cog, but she is rude towards them. She does not like the Cog. And she blames them for everything involving the Lambent. Unfortunately, her group over at the stadium is basically spread out because the Locust and Lambent attack, and they basically book it and leave. While over at the warehouse, we don't know what happens to the warehouse leaders situation, but I would assume because of how deadly the Lambent is, they might have evacuated later on. So we don't know the exact situation involving all of Hanover, but we do know that at least when we meet them, they seem like they're thriving and they've at least stationed themselves in areas, but at the end of the day, they all had to scatter. And that should do it for every major area of the Stranded when it comes to their camps or settlements that we at least see or we at least hear about. There are other areas, like there are some over at Timgad that are mentioned now and then, but we never see that, or at least we never see any of the Stranded in those areas. It's just, there was a Stranded camp here. Oblivion Central, I wasn't even sure about putting that on here, but I'm like, well, we do get the name of the leader. We do know it's Oblivion Central is the name of it, so it's like we have information. Dizzy was there. We might as well build this world up as we can. So I figured it was nice to actually touch on the Stranded, since we've been dealing with that a lot in the comics that we've been covering when this video is coming out. We've got the town of Frededicto, Farkidu, blah, 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 blah. We've got that town. We're going to Montevideo, and as we just talked about, there are Stranded there. In the next comic series, for Baron, we have the Grievous Bodily Love, so we're going to be dealing with them. And it's just interesting to touch on, yes, there are many groups that have different views, but they are all still Stranded at the end of the day. They still even consider themselves Stranded. Most of them, if you don't count the Grievous or Paddock. Or Alpha, in a way. They kind of did, but they didn't. But anyway, that'll do it. I want to thank everyone for watching. Thank everyone for making things possible. Thank the patrons for making things possible. And when we come back, we'll be continuing the comic series, and we'll be having more fun as we always do. I love you all to death. Later!